In the last section you did some addition and equation inequalities, but in this one there will be multiplication and division inequalities. And these are no different except just the operations involved. So I have 2x is less than or equal to 4, and we're to solve these. So I'll divide both sides by 2, and I have x is less than or equal to 2. And just like before, we'll graph these. Now, I do not have a ruler that I can use nicely here, so I'll just do it with a line. So here's 0, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. And since it's less than or equal to, I'll use a closed circle, and I will draw this facing to the left. And we should check a value of 0. So in my head I say 2 times 0 is nothing, and 0 is definitely less than 4. I can also check the crossing over point, like where it's at 2. So if I plug a 2 in here, 2 times 2 is 4, and that would be equal to 4. And you could really get outrageous if you wanted. You could try 2.1, and you'd be like, well, 2.1 is going to be a little bit larger than 4, so that would not work. You could try it as many times as you wanted. But yeah, that's a time management thing. You don't want to go crazy. Okay, let's look at something a little bit more difficult. And when I say a little bit more difficult, it's just because it involves fractions. So 1/4 of m is less than 1/2. Now the problem that we have here is we have 1 over 4 in front of our variable, and the opposite of a fraction, looking that way, we can just multiply both by 4. I'll sneak a 4 kind of angled up there. And 1/4 of 4 just simplifies to m is less than, and then I can show canceling if I want, 2. But for this one I probably just am going to write 2 because that's straightforward enough. M is less than 2. And on purpose I put a fraction here because maybe you would be tempted to want to like multiply by 2, but multiplying by 2 would only change the left fraction to 2 over 4. So that wouldn't get you all the way to the end of the problem. When I go to graph this, m is less than 2. Here's 0. Here's 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to make an open circle at 2 and shade this to the left. And if I check 0, 1/4 of 0 is nothing, and that is less than 1/2. So let's look at something involved a little different here. We have a negative. And we can talk more about this in person if you want, but for now I'm just going to mostly say that, by the way, I'm using a colored ink here, not red, so write this down. So when you multiply or divide by a negative, you have to flip the direction of the inequality. So you can think of that as like flipping the sign, but if I say sign, I'm probably thinking positive, negative. So yeah, go ahead and write that down. And then we'll move on to see what happens when we do problem 3. Negative 2/5 n, negative 2/5 n is less than negative 14. Now the issue here is that we have a uglier looking fraction. And maybe for this one, I'm going to show parentheses around the whole thing. Doesn't really matter. So I'm going to show times negative 5 over 2, and then times negative 5 over 2. Now we chose that number on purpose so that we would be left with just n. And then I have 14 over 2, and I'm really skipping that inequality for now just so I can talk about it, becomes a 7. 7 times 5 is 35, and a negative times a negative is positive. But since we chose to multiply by a negative, the sign that we're going to use has to turn around so it's no longer less than, it's greater than. And a real brief explanation, like if you think about opposites, what was a negative 5 is now 5. So like when I'm communicating relationships of greater than, they kind of just flip because you're making them the opposite side. And we can look more closely at that if you really want to kind of discuss the why, like the WHY behind the way that that is what it is. Now whenever you multiply and divide by a negative, there's more room for error. And since there's no room for error, it's good that you kind of practiced checking these earlier. So like let's think of a a number to try here? Well, I don't want to have to take 2/5 of some number, so I'm going to use 0. Well, 0 is not greater than 35, so the logic that I'm using is going to tell me that 0 should not work in this. So when I plug 0 into this equation, I get 0 is less than -14. That is not true, so that agrees with what I thought I'd find out, and that means that the work we did is correct. I think that what I just said there is a little bit complicated in the wording, so don't be afraid to use that jump back button and revisit what I just said, because that was a little bit confusing. So here's my number line. Here's 0. Here's 35. And I could have stopped at like 50 or something, but I'm going to put an open circle at 35 and draw to the right. Just keep this one simple. Okay, do problems 4 and 5 on your own, and I'll do problem 6 now. So if you want to get caught up and then visit with this, go ahead and do that. Or give yourself some room and watch me do the work for 6 and follow along. 3f is less than or equal to -9. Now the reason I put this in here real quickly is that we've been doing multiple problems where you've had to multiply by a negative, multiply by a negative, multiply by a negative. And whenever you do something repeatedly, you kind of get trained to do something a certain way. So this negative here might make you think you're going to change the direction of the sign. But I'm going to do this problem by dividing both sides by 3. And ask yourself, did we divide by a negative? No, we didn't. So when I write f, I'm going to still keep less than or equal to and then a 3 here. And just because I see a negative, that doesn't mean I have to flip it. So when I go to draw 0, 3, -3, this is going to be f is less than or equal to, closed circle, facing that way. If I plug 0 in, 3 times 0 gives me 0. 0 is not less than -9, so that would be one that shouldn't work. And when we check it, it doesn't. If I try -1 trillion, well, 3 times -1 trillion is a very large negative number, and that's definitely less than -9. We'll keep this video pretty to the point. I think the word problems should go fine. So if you need help with any word problems or anything, hit me up. But I think these are usually a little bit more straightforward than the addition and subtraction ones. So there's not too much going on in 6.2, in my opinion. Just don't forget that if you multiply or divide by a negative, you have to change the direction of the sign.